Hello and welcome to today's webinar as part of this year's Smart Money Week in Agriculture, brought to you by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Center for Agricultural Profitability and Nebraska Extension, with support from the North Central Farm and Ranch Stress Assistance Center. I'm Shannon Sand, agricultural economist with Nebraska Extension. Through daily webinars this week, Ag Smart Money Week aims to equip farmers and ranchers with the latest tools, information, and strategies to improve their financial management and risk management to build success in their business. You can find the full schedule and registration information on the Center for Ag Profitability's website, cap.unl.edu/smartmoney. This is a timely webinar looking at managing rising food prices amid inflation as we approach Thanksgiving. Most of us have seen food prices rise due to factors like increased feed costs and supply chain disruptions. You'll learn how inflation is calculated, what the key drivers are behind price hikes, and get practical tips for budgeting for the holiday season. To present, we are joined by Dr. Elliott Dennis, Associate Professor and Livestock Economist with the Department of Agricultural Economics here at Nebraska. We invite any questions during the presentation to be typed into the chat box or the Q&A. Elliott, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Shannon. We'll go ahead and share and we'll get going. Right. Are you seeing kind of in presentation mode, Shannon?
I am not seeing presentation mode. I am seeing your side of PowerPoint. There we go.
Okay, great. Is it moving now?
Yep, it's going.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I appreciate everyone being on here. As Shannon said, this is kind of a timely webinar, and really there will be a lot of reports coming out about the cost of Thanksgiving. We do want to touch on that, but mainly just talk about how inflation works, how it's calculated, and how it affects general prices. So before we get going, I just want to wish everyone kind of an early happy Thanksgiving, recognizing that this is a time when we have the opportunity to give thanks for the blessings which we've received, and also think about kind of the importance in our values, some of which could include family, friends, and higher power. But really, when we talk about the cost of Thanksgiving, you'll hear these over the next month or so. A lot of these reports come out, and really the idea of these reports is to give kind of some reliable picture about general inflation. Now, as economists, we talk about certain things like price elasticities or price sensitivity, trend, seasonality, inflation, and it becomes just kind of our natural way of talking about it. But for a lot of people as consumers, we have to try to find ways to kind of distill those concepts down into something that's relatable. And something like measuring the cost of Thanksgiving year over year tends to be kind of one of those easy ways to do that. And we can kind of talk about general trends such as inflation. It also highlights kind of what is the difference between the cost I'm seeing today versus what it was in the past, right? And so we generally calculate two different things. We talk about what is the real price. So if we take away inflation, what is that value? And what is the nominal price of the price we observe? Inflation causes prices to naturally rise over time. And sometimes we can kind of get in this, I'd say kind of a false dichotomy of saying, this is the price it was a year ago, but taking out inflation kind of says, is there general trends in that price? And for a lot of people, this Thanksgiving meal is viewed as kind of a large purchase by many. And for a lot of other organizations, they like to do it because it's kind of good public relations for them, gets their name out there, and also just kind of reminds them, especially kind of fee-based organizations, that that they're relevant thinking about their customers at that time of year. So real quick, let's just do an inflation crash course, because we hear about inflation a lot. I'm not sure we fully understand what inflation is or the numbers that inflation's actually even suggesting. So these are the four primary ways that inflation is calculated, and they all kind of mean different things. The most common, I would say, is the Consumer Price Index. This is the one that we hear a lot about. They say the CPI is going up. I've just kind of provided a definition for each one of these measures of inflation. But really what inflation is generally trying to do is take a basket of goods and say, how is that set basket of goods changed through time? And We can do that for consumers, but we can also do that for producers and the types of goods and services that they use. We call that the producer price index. So sometimes when we're thinking about how as producer prices increase for things like fuel, machinery, seed, etc., we'll calculate a producer price index. That's the one I would say as producers we tend to be most familiar with. The third is commonly used by the Fed Reserve and general government organizations. And really, this is called the Personal Consumption Price Index. And it measures these goods and services. And the reason why they like it is because they include both out-of-pocket expenditures paid for those on behalf of the household. So think of like healthcare. They're basically trying to get what is that total cost to that consumer. And so a lot of times you'll see this personal or PCE, personal consumption price index. And then if that weren't confusing enough, a lot of times the government will come and say, this is core inflation and kind of how it's moving. And so you can think if we have this big basket of goods, inflation could go up because of a few items. And so oftentimes what they try to do is they try to take away things that they perceive as being very volatile or the price changes very frequently. And so those two things that they primarily eliminate are food and energy. And so sometimes you'll even hear like, this is core inflation, or they'll say CPI inflation excluding fuel and food. And really what they're trying to do there is they're saying, we know these things move around a lot. So if we took those out, what is that basket of goods? Is that, if those stable prices are increasing, then we really have a problem. Now, there's pluses and minuses to all of these. But just to know that like when someone's quoting an inflation price or in the cost of inflation or inflation's going up, we just need to know what are they actually measuring and who is it affecting. Two other things that are often used in conjunction with inflation but are not actually inflation measures is this employment cost index or the commodity price index. These are generally our measures that we would use in kind of as producers to say, okay, what are these costs in, for instance, like labor, oil, metals, and different ag products. And so sometimes we'll use those. They don't measure inflation, but it's essentially we know that those will go into a basket of goods that could measure inflation. So we tend to track those because it affects us most. So I always like to say, like, when we're looking at a graph, it's that we should know kind of what we're looking at and how it's calculated. And oftentimes if there are deviations in that price, it's generally in the details and how we're calculating that. So the first is we can often talk about inflation in terms of relative to a base, or inflation has gone up, 100% since 1980, for example. So we have 1980 as our base, and we look at how prices have changed since 1980. We could also, what I'd say is probably most common when inflation is really going up quickly, which we saw this last couple of years, is we talk about year-over-year inflation. So what was prices today relative to they were a year ago? So prices today in November 2024 relative to what they were in 2023. And so this gives us, a kind of a comparison from the next. But it doesn't tell us a lot like, well, yes, it could have been going down 2% since last year, but since 2020, it's been up 30%. So we miss, so it's really important to look at both relative to a base and year-over-year comparison. Then we have to know, as I mentioned, what is in that basket of goods? Is it all of these items? What items are they measuring? And oftentimes the two categories that they list are all items, which is their basket, and all items minus food and energy, because they tend to be more volatile. Another way that you can see it calculated is they'll say it's a non-seasonally adjusted, or sometimes we just refer to as nominal inflation or seasonal adjustments. And so essentially when we think about prices, they go over time. There's seasonality that prices are going up and down, but that's just naturally when they go up and down. Think about cattle prices. A lot of cattle are coming to market right now for feeder cattle. So that larger supply is going to essentially reduce prices for feeder cattle on average. And so there's just this natural cycle that price patterns has nothing to do with the general trend in inflation, everything to do with just natural seasonal patterns. And so sometimes for those that have large seasonality patterns, they will do what's called seasonal adjusting. They basically take out all the seasonality, so all that you're viewing is just the trend. Um, and the last way that they kind of measure it is they'll look at, the different locations. So we can look at nationally, what's the city or metro inflation versus rural inflation. Or we can say, what is the, inflation here in Nebraska versus, or in the Midwest versus the East Coast. And so we can start to look at, how inflation is changing across areas. And then we can essentially piece through why that's actually happening at that time. So this is one of those examples, right? So this is the St. Louis Federal Reserve releases. It's a great website. You can find a lot of these graphs that I'm going to present. And if you're interested on each one of these graphs, in the bottom right-hand corner is actually the URL. You can just type in and it will pull up this exact same graph. You can mess around with the years and dates and a lot of things you can do. So we have two lines here. The blue line is the consumer price index for all urban consumers for all items, and it's for the city, right? And the red line is the same thing, it's just all items minus food and energy. So here we're looking at kind of same population, just look at, all items minus food. And what we see actually is the red item, tends, when we take that out, we tend to have less volatility, right? So that price is not jumping around as much. It tends to be a bit more constant, but you see that it does change, right? And kind of this is a year over year comparison. So if you look over here on this left-hand side, this is percent change year over year. So once again, it takes a month, the current month, and looks at what was the month last year. And so this is, I bring this one up because this is the one that's most frequently quoted in the news as when they talk about inflation. They say inflation is going down. And this is the chart that they're generally referring to. And they're generally referring to this red line. It's going down minus food and energy. And we're at, about, 2.75%, which means on average, prices are rising about, 3% a year. This is another way that, as I mentioned, you can calculate this just relative to a base. So this right here, that is 1982 is the base. And so that's where this black line going across is 100. And so that says, okay, from there, and then you can pick another date and you look, okay, from 1982 to 2008, prices went up about, 140%. So we can actually look at, okay, what was that price? If you're looking at a kind of a specific item that you're purchasing, there's this great tool from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you can actually calculate. It's an inflation calculator. There are a lot of these out there. I'm not advocating one or the other, but this is one that I frequently use. And you can look at, okay, what was my dollar worth in January 2020 versus now, and gets you an idea of actually how much inflation has gone up. So if you had $1.87 today, it would have been worth $1, 4 years ago. That's pretty high inflation. And this also kind of gets at the nomenclature of, you're talking to your grandparents or great-grandparents, and they're saying, when I was growing up, gas was, so many cents a gallon, or milk was so many cents a gallon when I was raising. I can't believe prices are that. Well, because we have inflation, prices will naturally rise. Now, that's a policy choice in the US that we have inflation. That's a separate conversation, but because as the US has taken the policy that they're okay with general average price, a rise in price between 2 to 3% a year, prices, our money is essentially worth less today than it is in the past. So what are some of those current drivers of inflation, and how does the federal government manage inflation? So we've heard a lot about, inflation's going up, and then in conjunction with that, we often hear kind of the same thing of like the Federal Reserve. And so I wanted just to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve and how they try to attempt to manage inflation, and then talk about what are some of the current drivers that we're having. So the first is that the really has this two-part system, which you'll hear. They're trying to maximize employment, or you can think about it in the opposite, minimize unemployment or reduce unemployment. and they're trying to go for price stability. And generally, when they're talking about price stability, they're talking about inflation at what they call an acceptable rate, which is generally thought to be anywhere to 2.5%, and it stays at 2.5% over time. It doesn't jump up and doesn't pop down. And then we can think about just kind of this maximum employment, or the people that are in the workforce who are looking for a job can find a job or are employed. Now, there's some nuances there that if you're unemployed, but you're not looking for your job, you're not currently unemployed. But really, it's if you're looking for a job and you can't find a job, you're considered unemployed. And so they're trying to minimize this unemployment. So these tend to be complementary. They can be in conflict with each other sometimes, but we tend to view these two kind of objectives that the Federal Reserve tries to do as complementary. And so the primary tool that they have to kind of manage this inflation is what they call essentially the federal funds rate. And this can think is like the cost of overnight borrowing for banks. And so the reason you might have heard this kind of in the news talking about the federal funds rates going up. This is the federal funds rate. And the reason why they're talking about that is the Federal Reserve essentially loans money to banks. Those banks essentially have to charge a markup on top of that, and they charge that to us as consumers. And so the federal fund rates for them essentially dictates what potential interest rates you'll be receiving as consumers. And so when we look at this graph, this is percent of that federal funds rate. You can think of it as like interest that they're charging banks. Really, after the 2008 banking crisis, the Federal Reserve essentially took a monetary policy and said, we're not going to charge anything, really zero interest. And so money was very, very, very cheap. And they're trying to do that because they want to encourage banks to start lending money. And then shortly after the presidential change between Obama and Trump, they said, okay, we're going to try to relax this because we can't just keep at zero forever. We have to release it. And so they started to do that. And then essentially COVID happened, and they said, okay, we need to put this down to zero again to essentially encourage spending. And they've done that. But as we've all known, people spent a lot of money, and there was a huge inflation issue. And so they quickly rose this up and have since recently started to bring that back down. So really, let's look at those two things that they're trying to accomplish, which is low unemployment, and essentially we've already looked at inflation. So really, when we're thinking about the unemployment rate as being about 4%, and a little bit higher than it was, it has started to creep back up. But really, I mean, it's almost, we've had the unemployment rate similar to where we were at in kind of the 2000s. So it is high. And really, we're talking about this direction. It was going down, and then it kind of came back down again. But essentially, there are people looking for jobs that can't find them. Which sounds crazy because we see a lot of job openings, especially in rural America. So one of the ways that they try to normalize this is they try to look for the total employment by the unemployment level. And so this is kind of a ratio. We can say, okay, are more people looking for jobs than are actually finding jobs? And really, we can see that there are a few more individuals looking for jobs than there are openings. And so which kind of leads to why we have kind of this perception that there are still people in the market looking for jobs. So what are some of those things that are really driving current inflation? We've heard primarily about two things. We heard about kind of domestic production levels. So this is generally around animal disease. And once we've produced those products and manufactured them into consumable items, they have to be essentially transported. And so if you remember COVID, there was this huge kind of run up in essentially freight going by truckers and also by ocean liners. And so you see actually, that's why that huge increase right there in essentially inflation. This is the producer price index. So on the producer side, specific to the cost of transportation. But really since, the last year, it's gone up a little bit, but it's really been negligible. So it hasn't really been a huge increase from the transportation side. And really what we're talking about is a lot of people have been talking about has been driving this has been high path. Um, this is kind of gives you an idea. This was released by the USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Services based out of Colorado. They monitor the animal health and safety throughout the United States. And you can see here in Nebraska, we have we've had 49 cases of bird flu that was detected. But we have, when we think about places like where turkey is produced, up in these areas, there were a lot more. And if you're interested, you can go to this website and search just by your county in Nebraska, and you can see what type of high path avian influenza was actually detected. So as I mentioned, this is where a lot of that turkey production actually happens. It happens elsewhere, but the USDA doesn't fully survey them because it's just not a large amount. And when they're trying to maximize their budget, but this is where a lot of those birds are produced, and unfortunately, that's where a lot of the high path. If you look here, that's where a lot of those high path avian influenza was actually detected, and birds were essentially terminated. And so you can see through time, yes, it's been happening, but really we've had fewer cases than we've had in the past, and now we're just still in the process of actually rebuilding those flocks. So where do we actually get price data if we're thinking about, I'm interested in a product and I want to see how this has changed over time. Well, you're not going to go through all that. We generally don't want to go through all the hassle of collecting that data and plotting it. So a lot of times we'll create dashboards as economists to kind of make these prices more accessible and user friendly. I think Purdue University does a really good job at this. They have this kind of food center over there, or ag food center, and you can look at a lot of different products over time, and this essentially, these are monthly prices, and they're at a specific dollars per pound or at a certain weight. And you can really look at what is the nominal price or what is the current price that you would potentially observe nationally. What if we took out inflation? What would be that price over time? And then what would be that price divided by like the number of hours or hourly wage? So you can see how much it's a relative cost to produce an item. So I just kind of look at, this is turkey. You can kind of see the natural seasonality that kind of pops up and down, and kind of where we were at. A nice thing to do is just because it's Thanksgiving or that around Thanksgiving doesn't mean that everyone's going to consume turkey, right? There are some people who have traditions where they will produce or they'll eat ham on Thanksgiving. It's not everyone eats turkey, and so you can say, okay, if I were to purchase a ham versus turkey, how much would this cost? And so you can kind of look at what those prices would be over time. You can also download this data if you're really interested and kind of mess around with it. So that's out there if you're just thinking about just long-term trends. What is this? I'm kind of curious. I think Purdue is kind of those. Purdue University just has a really great dashboard, and once again, the link is down below. So let's get to it. What is actually this cost of Thanksgiving when we think about it? Really, when we think about, you can look at where we're at relative to 2018, which I like to do compared to kind of where they were at. And so this is kind of one of those brief estimates. It's like, okay, we can look at what does a Thanksgiving meal include. You can start to delete a lot of these items. You can say, nope, I don't really eat stuffing. So there's that cost reduction. I make my biscuits from scratch. And so it's not going to cost me that, or, you can think of a lot of things, but this kind of just gives you kind of that broad kind of a barometer for what's it's going to cost and what might be in kind of in that menu. So really the big item or the big purchase item when I think about what is going to essentially capture the most is really going to be the turkey price. And when we think about how much butter you use, it's going to be those two primary items. Butter, eggs, and turkey are generally the items that generally consist about 30 to 40% of that total Thanksgiving dinner. So let's look at the turkey prices. So as I mentioned, during 2023, we had a lot of that high path avian influenza. A lot of our turkeys were dying. We had to essentially depopulate them. And so they were kind of really, really expensive at that time. And then as we started to rebuild those herds, prices started to fall. And really over this last year, this is for a turkey, which is a hen. So hens, which are female turkeys, tend to be a little bit smaller. And then we have toms, which if you're buying a larger, 24 to 30-pound turkey, that's going to be a tom. And hens are generally what most people purchase between 8 and 16 pounds, but really it's about 95 cents a pound. This is on the wholesale side. So there's a lot of people who actually monitor this cost of Thanksgiving. So as you start to think about, I'm interested in kind of what this cost is over time. Different people have different ways of calculating it. They're in different areas. I just put, four that I think that I've looked at in the past, and these are from last year because a lot of people haven't put theirs out yet. But you can go and look at American Farm Bureau cost of Thanksgiving. That's probably the one we're most familiar with. So different people have different things that they include in it. So feel free to just peruse kind of those and kind of see what that cost is that they're putting up. Really, but costs are what they kind of are, but how do we actually take, what we might produce for a Thanksgiving meal and say, okay, knowing what we know about inflation, how do we get our dollar to stretch a little bit more and still kind of maintain some of our favorite family traditions? Probably the biggest thing that's gotten the most news right now has really been these, I'd call them feast deals that a lot of people are putting out. This was first started by Aldi, and then since then, a lot of other retailers have really been in the mix for this. And so Aldi came out and said essentially for $10, you can get this feast meal for essentially for $10 or for 10 individuals, it will cost you $47. And it's not necessarily like a huge discount. Like you could actually go, and I looked at this a couple of days ago at Aldi. Like you could go to Aldi and actually physically buy each one of these items. And so it's not like they're giving you a deal for buying it in bulk. They're just saying, hey, these are generally the items that you would purchase, and you can purchase them all together. And if we add up this price, it's going to cost you $47. You still have to cook it all and make it, but they're just saying this is what it costs. The other one over here is kind of the same concept as Walmart. After Aldi kind of came out with this, Walmart essentially came out with a similar kind of thing. They said it was going to be longer. They're giving this deal all the way till the end of essentially to Christmas. So you could buy it for Thanksgiving and for Christmas. So, and essentially they're averaging at about $7. So I was curious and said, okay, where are all these meal deals that are out there? And essentially, these are kind of the primary major retailers that most of us would shop at. Aldi has their deal, Target has their deal, Amazon Fresh has their deal, Walmart and Sam's Club. These first four are the most similar in the sense of it's a traditional turkey meal with a few sides that you can make. Sam Club is more expensive, but the reason why is because they provide a ham in there instead of a turkey and a few more items. But what I thought was curious is, yes, everyone's coming out the meal deal, but it's not the same meal deal, right? So a lot of the times it has to do with serving size. So notice Aldi is $47 for 10 people, which is about $4.70. Target has a $20 Thanksgiving meal, but it's only for 4 people. And so it's at kind of that same price point. Amazon, $30, but for 6 people. So essentially all of these different retailers are providing the same type of meal deal or feast deal, just at different serving sizes or for number of individuals. They do include different baskets of goods. And so maybe you don't like yams and you don't make candied yams for Thanksgiving. That's okay. No one's going to judge you on that. But if you don't necessarily want to buy that in your feast meal, if it's not, if you're not going to consume it. So just make sure you kind of shop around when you think about these items here and these kind of feast deals. Just know that they're out there, and they can buy them. Once again, as I pointed out with Aldi, it's not necessarily you're buying the prepared meal, it's just they're buying all the items to make Thanksgiving dinner. So, but what if you're kind of in this kind of consumption where you're like, I really like, kind of a Thanksgiving meal, but I'm okay purchasing it from kind of a local producer. How do I find a local turkey producer or a local hog producer? This is kind of some ways that you can go and look for those. Uh, Obviously, we have the farmers market here in Lincoln. In Omaha, they have a farmers market. In other locations, they have different smaller farmers markets. So obviously, that's a great place just talking with producers. We have the Buy Fresh, Buy Local here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Other states also have Buy Fresh, Buy Local. We produce a guide there, and I'll kind of show you some of those people who provide local turkeys. Obviously, Facebook Marketplace, Nebraska Local or local farmers markets. Facebook page is a great kind of solution for that. You can post what you're looking for, and different producers will respond. Or a lot of times, producers just post there for their items, and you can look there. The last is kind of the Nebraska Department of Agriculture has a food and meat directory. If you're looking for a list of producers that actually provide these items, and they get this list from people who are authorized to sell in Nebraska. So let's just give you an idea of how you do this. If you're to look at kind of local turkeys in Nebraska, we have 4 individuals that are listed with the Buy Fresh, Buy Local program. There could be others, but just 4 that were listed with this program. These are the 4 ones. We're not endorsing any one of these, but the fact that we provide this kind of information, you can go Buy Fresh, Buy Local turkeys. And I did put that website up there, but I'll put it in kind of the finished documents, and then you can essentially have that conversation with them and purchase it. The last is, if you're thinking about, buying from these local producers, the question that I always ask myself is like, am I getting a good deal? Is this price in relation to where it kind of should be? And I think about, USDA does a great job of collecting a lot of price information for us, which a lot of us use on a kind of on a daily basis. One of those reports that I think doesn't use as much by us as producers is the retail report. And recently, the retail report changed or slightly modified to actually include more of what we'd call this environment tab over here. And so this is trying to capture a lot of these products that are not necessarily conventionally raised. And we can think about this in terms of like grass-fed, cage-free eggs, antibiotic-free, hormone-free. And so they're going to essentially look at, what is that price nationally and by region. So you can go to this, look at that retail report for that week and say, okay, what is that antibiotic-free price over time? Okay, so just kind of concluding with some just practical advice when we think about just smart savings in general, but particularly in kind of this inflationary time. But I always like to think about this comment that you often hear about. It's like everything you need to know you learned in kindergarten, right? Well, in Thanksgiving time, I thought you'd change that and say everything you need to know about Thanksgiving you probably learned from your grandma, right? And well, what would grandma say? She would probably say, although we're trying to shop for this meal and get good discounts and provide a fun meal, and there's going to be stress, remember that it's not about the meal. People who are at the meal are more important than the meal itself. So as we start to go around, we start to purchase these items, and the stress and all this stuff of building, building the meal and putting it together. Remember that people who are there are more important than the actual meal. But if you are hosting, of course, these are just, tried and true, make a budget, stick to it. Maybe we have to leave a couple things off our item, but I think, putting a budget and then sticking to it is always sound advice. Of course, there's coupons. I mentioned and highlighted a few of those. We can always shop around. Ads are a great way to do that. But then kind of costing your time if you're driving a large way across town. maybe that, that 50-cent discount that you got wasn't worth it because you paid more on gas. And maybe your time is worth more than the 50-cent discount that you got. So it's good to shop around, but be practical about it. And then if we're having multiple guests kind of come over from different families, it's probably okay to ask them to bring a few items and kind of share that load. And then kind of that last thing that, at least my grandma always said is when in doubt, do without. Kind of, if we're sticking with our budget and recognizing that people are more important than the meal, then it's okay at certain times to say we don't have everything that we need to this year, but we're grateful for the things that we have. And with that, I'll just take any questions about just generally how we calculate inflation, where we're, what are some of those drivers, kind of what's that cost of Thanksgiving, and what are kind of some of those practical how-to. And so I'll turn it back over to you, Shannon, to kind of lead that part of the discussion.
Okay. Well, we'll give it just a few minutes.
Yeah.
So, but I will say my grandma didn't say that. She always said, "We're feeding them, not fattening them." So, you know,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Get kind of that same idea that, the
Uh-huh.
idea is to provide a meal, but the meal is not the end all. It's the vehicle to facilitate something, which
Being
is family.
together. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's always the more important thing. So, I do have one question. So, I feel like this kind of maybe fluctuates every year, but it seems like if you can wait to buy your turkey till like a week or 2 before Thanksgiving, sometimes it's like a better deal. Are there specific times of the year for that where like they're just better sales in general if someone's looking to buy like turkey or even ham? Because like you said, some people do prefer ham over turkey.
Yeah, so most of the time, the best time to buy it is actually the week after Thanksgiving. And so a lot of
Well, that
times
makes
what
sense. Okay, because it's left. Yeah, yeah. It's
yeah,
not
so
leftovers, but it's excess. Yeah.
yeah, so this is a good example of that, right? So if we look at the price of turkeys, you generally see this is around Thanksgiving, and there
Mhm.
is a general price decline as you go through time. And
Yeah.
so I know we can't do anything about that now, but if you're thinking like I'm gonna plan for potentially next year, uh, my mom used to, go out and we'd buy, 3 or 4 turkeys that we'd eat throughout the year, and then we'd
Hmm.
we'd have a deep freeze. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of the practical. But if we're thinking kind of about, given the current price trends where we're at, you
Yeah.
know, they're probably, the price that you're probably seeing today is most likely the price that you're gonna see, in in a couple weeks. And
Okay.
let's say it is, I think I was looking at it and it was like $1.29 at Aldi or something like that, a pound,
Yeah.
and it's a 10-pound bird. And it goes the most
Not
time
bad.
they're gonna discount, 10 cents. You're gonna save yourself $1. And
Yeah.
it's not huge savings. The ham is a little bit different, and if you're boning out the ham, it's gonna be more expensive. If it's pre-cooked and spiral cut,
Or
that
yeah.
is going to be more expensive. So uh thinking about, what labor do you want to do and how much do you want to just like, I just want to just heat it up and put the glaze over it and be done with it.
Yeah.
So
Depending on the year, that might be the case. So,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and I also thought it was very like practical, like you stated. Like, look at those prices. But if you live 45 minutes outside of town, is it going to be worth it to go pick up the one? Or, like you said, if you have the deep freeze space, you might want to go get four. Or
Yeah.
again, if you're running other errands, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the things that we often talk. I mean, I used to run around with my mom a lot. And even as a little kid, I was like, we are spending like 3 hours getting 4 different items at each store. And I think that was kind of the culture, and that can
Yeah.
be true. And I think the movement towards just buying stuff on Amazon has really kind of challenged that concept of, can you get the same items and reduce your cost, both time and fuel, and
Yeah. If
so
you can just go and pick it up and get done with it, I'm a big
mhm,
fan.
yeah.
But
And what
again,
they've shown, in like if you're concerned about sticking with the budget, a lot
yeah.
of research has been done that easiest way to do that is to shop online,
Oh,
in the
yeah.
sense of like instead of going to the store. And they said so like that's why a lot of people are doing the Sam's Club pickup now.
I was like,
So,
I do Walmart pickup every Friday. I
yeah,
was like, and it's great because I like put everything in the cart and then I make my decisions and then I'm like, well, I
right.
don't really need this or that or whatever. And then I'm within my budget every time.
Yep,
So
that's
yeah, it's
that's
great.
exactly right.
Yeah, I agree.
So if you're thinking about that, just kind of that practical advice of just like recognizing that prices will go up every year because the US has a policy for inflation. Sometimes it goes up faster than others.
Yeah.
And then particular items, the price is going to vary given year to year based upon the underlying fundamentals in production normally. So when we think about food items and so.
Okay. Well, that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, if no one has any questions, I just want to wish everyone on the call a happy early Thanksgiving and hope that everyone kind of has enjoyable kind of kickoff to kind of the holiday season.
Yeah. I don't see anything coming in. So, well, thank you for joining us today, Elliot.
Yeah.
Oh,
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. And if there's any
yeah.
questions about everything, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you to everybody for joining us today during Egg Smart Money Week. Free webinars continue through Friday, and you can find the schedule and registration information at cap.unl.edu/smartmoney. As you close out of Zoom, you will see a brief evaluation about today's webinar. We would really appreciate your feedback about this presentation and ideas for future sessions. Have a great afternoon.